This is episode number 8 with Steve Hall. Welcome to the Grow Podcast with myself, David O'Connor, where my goal is to interview world-class guests so you can constantly progress as a person in terms of your training, your mindset and nutrition. So without further ado, let's dive in. How are we keeping, guys? And a big welcome back to the Grow Podcast. And today we're talking all things basically around muscle gain, or hypertrophy 101 if you like, and kind of like the volume needed to get there and stuff like where the hell do you go once you're going to get past, let's say, training for a few months or even a couple of years in the gym, and you've maybe come to a plateau and you're not gaining as much as you thought you would, or you're not progressing as much as you thought you would. So today I'm diving into all things hypertrophy, volume, how much, how often, how hard do you push in the gym, and then we're talking about phasing going forward from there, which is exciting to set yourself up for, let's say, continued body composition gains. So I'm doing this with none other than Steve Hall, who is a natural bodybuilder. He's an online personal trainer as well, and he's big into his content production as well, but he's going to get into that himself in a couple of minutes. And again, like, I came across Steve probably a year and a half ago at this stage, just by the sheer quality of information he puts out there. And again, there's no bullshit with him, there's no kind of airy-fairy stuff with him, if you like, and he's genuine, and that's kind of the biggest thing that I take away from Steve. And of course, I met him a few weeks ago at a conference that he put together as well, which went down a treat. So I'm going to stop talking and just welcome Steve onto the podcast. So, Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, David.
Yeah, and I suppose it was nice to finally meet you briefly over at the Mike Israel conference a few weekends back. So it's nice to have you on the podcast so soon after that as well. But even for our listeners that may not know who Steve is, just create a small bit of context, Steve, on basically, well, who is Steve?
Cool. So I am Steve Hall of ReviveStronger.com. Is like where you'll be able to find all our content. I myself am a natural bodybuilder. I have competed in powerlifting, but I wouldn't call myself a powerlifter at the moment. I've got a few things that hold me back from that. I am an online coach, so I coach people over the internet, or online personal trainer, might help people. So very much programming for training and nutrition, helping mostly bodybuilders, powerlifters, people interested in that, a lot of personal trainers and coaches, and then some general population as well. And I have Pascal Flor, who is also a coach on the team. I'm also a content producer, so I have a podcast myself, the Revive Stronger podcast, which is really, really fun. I get to talk to a lot of experts across the world. And then I have a blog, which I release normally one article per week. And then I'm pretty prolific across Facebook and Instagram, or try to be. And yeah, I myself am living in London and enjoying things. So that's it, I guess, in a roundabout way, who I am.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. And just for the record, you are producing a lot of content, so don't doubt yourself on that. And Steve, something I like to always kick off the podcast as well at the start is it's more of a challenge for you than anything else. And it's, if you were to describe in 10 seconds or less, like what you actually do, how would you condense that down?
Whoa, that is a challenge. I've seen, I saw this asked recently in a Facebook group, because I was like, how do I condense this? But I think it's basically, I used to have a good summary for this, and I've gone way over the 10 seconds and completely rambled on a side tangent. I guess it's online. It's 24-hour training, nutrition, programming with an education, 24-hour support for your training and nutrition, with an education attached would be what I do. That is what the prime income I get is online coaching. So yeah, that's what I would do it in a small summary, but probably really bad.
No, it's a nice way of summing it up, because a lot of people I'm noticing there's a trend in what people are saying, and a few things are the same, so it's nice to get a different spin on it. So, we were chatting off air about kind of where we're going to take this podcast, and I suppose I'm going to start at like the beginning of, we'll just say some guy starts out training in a gym, and we'll kind of take him on his journey through there, and we'll get deep into things like from the beginner to kind of programming stuff and like phasing stuff going forward. So yeah, like I suppose we've all gone through this, myself included, but what, in your opinion, where do most people go wrong when they're starting off?
So I think most people initially going into the gym, especially males more so than females, they go into the gym thinking they know it all already. They go into the gym thinking that they can do all the exercises they need to do, that if they just work hard in the gym and work the muscles they want to grow, they'll see the results they want. And whilst as a beginner, that's absolutely true, you'll see results no matter almost what you do, you will hold yourself back, and you might even cause yourself more harm than good by not having a good understanding of exercise technique, of the importance of compound lifts, the importance of recovery, and how often you should go into the gym and train as well. These are all important kind of major principles that are not understood by the general trainee who just goes into the gym. You effectively have no education. I can relate this to how kind of, on a basic level, a lot of kids, when they go to kind of eat, they don't really know what they should be eating. They're learning from maybe their parents who might not know. They don't get taught at school what they should be eating. And so this leads to what you could call like an obesity epidemic in some ways, because there's a lot of tasty food and kids want to eat tasty food. Much like the male guy that goes into the gym, wants to get a big chest and big biceps, he goes in and just does chest and bench press. And he could cause himself some kind of muscle imbalances. He could cause himself an injury on the bench press if he doesn't know how to perform a safe and secure bench. So I think a pure lack of just general education and knowledge for the initial gym trainee. The reason I say it's more males than females is just generally females are a bit more receptive to maybe getting a personal trainer who can help educate them with the basics, or they might already look up beforehand going in, whereas a man either will just go in and just do what they think's right, or they're looking like Flex magazine or Men's Health, which would be better than nothing, but not an education. That is not an education by any means. So yeah, I think that would be the number one thing that holds people back in the beginning would be that.
Cool. And like you touched on the fact that by doing anything, they're probably going to make progress. So there's a term thrown around the internet for this called Newbie Gains, and I suppose a lot of people wouldn't have heard of it before. But like, how far could I get if I just kind of went into the gym and like just thought I was doing okay with things? And usually the way I hear things from guys is that, oh, I'm going to the gym 4 or 5 days a week, and then that's one aspect of it. Then when you ask them what they actually do, it's either one extreme or the other. For me, it's more like, oh, I go on the treadmill, the rower and all this kind of stuff. Or then you have the other guy who does like all the isolation machines and stuff, and maybe he tries to squat and stuff, but you kind of, you know yourself that the technique is definitely not there, the progression is definitely not there, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, like how long does that newbie phase last, or might it last? Like, are we talking months, years, weeks, or what, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, unless the person gets injured, which is quite likely in some cases, I think you can probably ride out pure, absolute, like obnoxious, no idea what you're doing in the gym for a few months. I think after a few months, you've probably kind of completely got all the gains you could possibly get from doing random things. I think after that, if you get a little bit of structure, and a little bit of an awareness of, oh, I need to train my legs, oh, I can squat, oh, I've been taught how to squat, I can do this, I think then you get into some real good, like much better gains, and you can ride out those, and those I'd still consider newbie gains to an extent, because it's still new stimulus to you. And as soon as you get into scientific, kind of the stuff we're probably going to talk about later, training and nutrition, you start actually nailing those basics, that education I was talking about, then you can even ride that out for a good period of time. But I think literally having no clue what you're doing, you'll still see results for like 3 months probably, but after that you're really going to struggle. And that's probably where people start then looking at personal trainers, or they look at Men's Health magazines, or they start Googling and they find bodybuilding.com and they start going on those websites, and then they kind of write those out for a little bit, and then they take it a step further. And I think it's a very much progression through kind of an education. It takes people a long time. It did for me, take me a long time to eventually find a good source of education and kind of the scientific principles of training and nutrition. And then I saw probably as good Newbie Gains as I saw when I initially got into the gym, which is fantastic. But if I could have skipped all of that and just gone straight to knowing actually what I should be doing, it would have made things a lot quicker and I would have seen much more results a lot sooner.
Yeah, I think there's two kind of ways this goes in my head anyway as well, because when I started training first all those years ago, like I probably did make a lot of progress in the first 3 to 4 months if I managed to stay away from the pub rather than the gym long enough back in college. But yeah, for me it was a lack of consistency a lot of the time. You'd be going great for a few weeks and then a night out would come along and throw you off whack and you wouldn't get back in for the few weeks. But one big thing then that I see, like if somebody is kind of too stubborn or the ego is too big to seek help at the end of that, let's say, quote unquote newbie stage, they could probably stay spinning their wheels for years without actually making progress. But they're going to the gym and all they're really doing is exercising. They're just expanding energy and not really doing anything to adapt and change. But I was getting on a point there. What was I going to say about that? Yeah, I suppose so. The first thing, Steve, from here is just getting a bit of basic structure and overall probably like exercise selection. What kind of split are you doing across a week? Would you kind of go from there?
Yeah, I guess the first thing a newbie wants to be looking at when they are looking at, or someone who's kind of ridden out that initial newbie gains, they want to, first of all, first things first, you want to know the proper form. So they really, really want to learn probably from, if they can, not be self-taught and actually get taught by a personal trainer. They're going to help themselves a lot. It's kind of like going through a PlayStation game or whatever console you have, whatever takes your fancy, and just going at it and trying to do the game as per just playing it, like you probably should be doing. Or you can have a walkthrough guide and follow that, and you're going to finish the game a lot quicker. Now, you want that quicker progress in the gym. You want to have like a helping hand if you can, and having a personal trainer who's good, who can teach you how to squat, how to do a hip hinge, how to deadlift, how to row, how to retract your scapula properly on a bench press. These sort of key individual aspects is really, really going to help you, because then you can make that form that you've learned at the start something that you carry on for the rest of your training career, rather than doing what a lot of us do, and something I've done all the time is I was self-taught with a lot of this, and I've updated my technique time and time again where I just get frustrated, and I'm like, now finally after training for like 5 years, I'm like, right, Steve, you've got good technique now, don't fuck around. Whereas I wish I'd done that from the beginning, because it just makes results faster, safer, and easier to log and track. So I think first things first, get yourself a walkthrough guide, get yourself something that's going to set you up for success. And then in the same kind of way of that, I guess my walkthrough guide was Starting Strength initially by Mark Rippetoe, and in that itself it had a good basic layout for a program. Just having a plan of sorts is going to help someone tremendously. So they go into the gym and they've kind of got a bit of a balance when they've got something working their quads. They've also got something working their hamstrings, their glutes. When they work their chest, they've also got some work on their back. They're not just kind of doing lots of the same movements for the same muscle groups. And then if they can work those muscle groups twice through the week, that's going to help them tremendously. And if they can actually do it even more as a novice, because they can recover pretty quick, because they're not using heavy weights, they're not super strong, they can recover from squats. They can probably squat 3 times a week, whereas when they get really strong, they're not going to be able to do that. But the benefit of being able to squat 3 times a week is they learn that technique even faster, and they see better results via that. So if they can get into something like a full body routine that takes them through everything 3 times a week, they are going to start learning their technique really quick. They're going to start seeing great results coming. And yeah, that would be a great basis to go from. I think keeping things simple, just having compound lifts like a squat, bench, deadlift, and a row variety and like some pull-ups would be fantastic. If they want to throw in some isolation stuff, that's definitely the icing on the cake, or even the sprinkles. But the core lifts should definitely be there from the get-go. So yeah, I guess the novice should definitely concern themselves with learning the technique properly, getting into the gym quite frequently, doing the lifts. So up to kind of 3 times a week would be fantastic. and then looking to then actually every single time they go into the gym, try and progress, try and get out an extra rep, maybe add a little bit of weight, because they'll be able to progress really, really quick. They'll be like a weed wanting to grow, not like a big, full-grown tree, like someone advanced who's not going to grow very quickly at all. So, yeah, I think that would be my roundup for what a novice would want to look to do.
Cool. I think one thing that I meant to touch on, Steve, as well, going back to just the whole novice stage, is that like if you are starting out and you do have the brains to seek help, just it's kind of hard these days as well. You need to be able to keep an open mind and see the source you get that from, because as we've already said, no matter what you do, you're probably going to make progress. So let's just say if you went onto a coach or an online coach that seems to be popping up everywhere these days without any background or experience coaching real people, no matter what they make you do, you're probably going to get results from it, and that can be like a false view of that coach then for the future as well. So just, I suppose it's something just to mention and be mindful of, because people don't understand that when they're looking from the outside in as well, and things like Instagram and whatnot. You might see someone gain a lot of muscle in a short period of time, and while that could be perfectly realistic for that person, it could be just the fact that they're literally brand new to training in general. But yeah, like we talked about the compound moves and movements back in episode 1 if you're a regular listener to the show, guys. So again, it's a nice refresher for Steve to bring it up, and go back to episode 1 if you've missed that as well. But compounds first, and your main fundamental movements like squat, push, pull, hip hinge. And I suppose then from there, Steve, let's just say if they are doing full body structure 3 times a week, and then right now comes a stage where they are adding 2.5 to 5 kilos maybe a week to their main lifts. But they're starting to come to a stage now where they're getting damn strong. Maybe they do have great help with their technique and whatnot. Let's just pretend that aspect is covered. Where should they kind of go next in terms of progression as a whole, and like volume, intensity, frequency, deloads, like all that kind of world of stuff, we'll say?
So, just to touch actually on your point in terms of be careful with who you pick. I think that needs to be repeated, and that could be a whole podcast in itself. And how do you vet the personal trainer you're going to pick? Because it's your body, it's nutrition, it's training, and they could possibly tell you supplementation as well. And I know a lot of people who have been like moved the wrong way, and they haven't seen the results they want. They've spent a lot of money on poor personal training or online coaching. So definitely vet your sources. Just like if you're having some like major surgery done, you wouldn't just go to any old surgeon to get it done. You'd go and see who was recommended, who's had good results. You'd look up maybe some articles that they've written and make sure that they know their stuff. So definitely do that, guys. Like if you're wondering how to go about it, just actually kind of investigate a little bit. It doesn't take much to find if they're kind of full of crap or not. So yeah, to answer your question, I think once they're at this stage and they're in a really good position now, they really need to think about what is it they want to achieve. Do they want to get really strong, or do they want to get really big? And I think whatever the actual answer is, if they even do want to get really strong, they should probably get really big, because that's going to help them get really strong later. And once they're at this stage, they're not that big. So I'm assuming they're going to want some muscle hypertrophy, and they've already had a decent amount, but they've got a lot more to come if they start getting their training a bit more structured. So if we're talking about muscular hypertrophy, I think, this is when periodization really comes to the fore. And for the most part, to make it fairly simple, they can use a wide variety of rep ranges to produce hypertrophy, and that's been obviously shown. But for them, they want to focus on that 8 to 12 rep range. That would be a great starting point. That's a really good kind of sweet spot in terms of enough intensity to cause adaptions, but also you can get out loads of volume, and volume is going to be key for them. And then with addition to that, again, training muscle groups, they might want to go to an upper-lower split. If the full body split is kind of becoming too taxing, they're finding that they're not recovered in time to hit squats 3 times a week. They can just do them twice a week, that sort of thing. They might find that they can also start chucking in some isolation movements more so, because they've split up their training, so they can focus on hitting all the upper body and then all the lower body, so they can throw in maybe some calf raises, some bicep curls, some triceps, assuming that they just want full body hypertrophy and they're just going for an overall more muscular physique. And then also they've spread out their volume a bit more so they can actually get in more volume. Although the frequencies come down for some of the big kind of compound lifts, they can keep their isolation movements at higher frequency. So biceps, smaller muscle groups like the calves, the biceps, those sort of things can be trained fairly with high frequency, and they can get overall more volume via that. So they're focusing on the 8 to 12 rep range. Maybe they've gone to an upper lower split, so they're hitting muscle groups at least twice a week, up to 4 times per week. And then they're looking to progress, like I said, volume's very important. They're looking to progress with volumes on a week-to-week basis and then on like a month-to-month basis. And that can be done in a variety of different ways. And the actual way you do it isn't too important. Sets are going to give you more volume. Reps are going to give you the next amount. And then weight will give you a small smidge of volume. And what I would say is definitely focus on where you can to do sets. And then if failing that, you've got reps and you've got weight coming as well. And think of that as on a week-to-week basis. And if you're progressing there, you'll come to a point which is probably for most people from about 4 to 6 weeks in which you'll be like, I can't progress. There's nothing more I can do. And in fact, if I tried to do another week, I'd probably regress. And at that point is where we'd introduce the deload. And the deload is just a reduction in both your training volume and your intensity. But mostly volume, so you can do something like chopping your volume in half, so maybe half the number of sets you've been doing in your first week of training, and reduce the intensity by about 10 to 20% would be a good rough figure. And then within this, they can start think about auto-regulation. So I don't know if you've talked about the RPE scale, rate of perceived exertion, before, but they can start thinking about that and thinking about kind of how hard are they pushing. So within all of this, they don't really want to be pushing to failure, but they want to be thinking, maybe I could do like 1 or 2 more reps, and possibly then kind of rating their workouts, getting more familiar with how they're feeling, get a better connection for their body, and then they can also start introducing the RPE scale. So even use that and be like, week 1, I'm going for RPE 7, so 3 reps in reserve, and then the next week they progress and they go, okay, I'm going to RPE 8, 2 reps in reserve, and then the next week RPE 9, so they're only leaving 1 rep in the tank, and then the week after that they're like, right, yeah, that's probably when I need to deload today. That's a 3 to 1 kind of accumulation to deload paradigm if they wanted to go down that route. So yeah, I think first things first is they can probably do with spreading out that volume that they're doing, so they can actually kind of recover in time and produce overloads for those muscle groups. And then also look to progress via volume week to week. And if I was going to give a standard figure of where to start, maybe the first week of a mesocycle, which is effectively what we were talking about there, probably the data is kind of suggesting that 10 sets per muscle group is a good minimum place to start. So 10 sets spread out through the week. So if you're doing that upper lower split on your upper days for chest, maybe you do 5 sets on Monday and then another 5 sets on like the Thursday, and that'll get you your 10 sets. See how you're doing, see how you're progressing. Do you feel recovered? Are you sore? If you're not, then add a set, maybe 1 or 2 to the next week, and then go from there. How are you progressing? How are you feeling? And you can then kind of identify eventually what your maximal recoverable volume is, which is the most volume you can do and recover from. And you want to kind of work up towards that within your training career. But I'm probably getting on a quite in depth there and maybe a bit too far away from the initial question.
No, there is just for whoever is listening, there is an absolute wealth of info in there. I think we're going to spend a bit longer talking about those, Steve, just to kind of probably just dissect it a bit more. Okay, so let's pretend I want to get big. I want to build muscle. I'm doing my 3 days a week. You said first upping my volume, okay? And you said one of the best ways to do that first would be to maybe up my frequency from 3 days to 4 or 5 days a week. And once I do that, then I have room to add in more isolation exercises, because now I've gone from like 3 sessions across the week to 4 or 5. I've basically like need more time so I can do more. And then you talked about adding sets. Why would I approach adding sets in that 8 to 12 rep range, let's say, above trying to really focus on adding weight to the bar every week? Like, why is sets more important here? To an extent, I don't want to say it's... Yeah, so...
Yeah, so it's not something I used to ever do. It was always weight. It was always intensity. That was always the way people thought of progressive overload and how I thought about it, because everything I've read, and when you read like sports textbooks, and I'd learned from Mark Ripito and things like this, and you look at programs like 531 or something like that, a lot of people know Starting Strength 531, Jim Wendler's 531. They were all strength programs. They're all kind of targeting strength progression. Nothing was written for hypertrophy specific. And then when you look at the data, and this has been said so many times by Brad Schoenfeld, and there's a clear dose-response relationship between volume and muscle growth. Not intensity and muscle growth, volume. So the best way to kind of grow muscle is actually through volume progressions. And when you add a set onto an exercise versus weight, you're adding a lot more volume, because you're adding, another set of, maybe it was 100 kilos, 3x10, and then you've done the next week 100 kilos, 4x10. You've added an extra kind of a load more volume versus doing 105 the next week, and maybe you're lucky if you get 3x10 again. That is still far less volume, and so the actual overload week to week is less. So it's going to be likely, and we can't say for sure because I'm not sure there's even data to support this suggestion, but theoretically less of a stimulus for muscle growth. So that's why sets, because generally what you want for hypertrophy is a progression biasing volumes over intensity. Not saying intensity cannot help, and there is a point to that as well. But for the most part, it's volume that's king. Whereas when we're talking strength, then you would bias intensity progressions, weight on the bar, rather than volume. And a lot of these strength programs even have you decreasing your volume week to week, and potentially even over a mesocycle to mesocycle. And that's great for like 531, for example, where you go from 5s to 3s to 1s. That's great for like peaking your strength and performing well. That doesn't necessarily mean it's very good for building muscle, and you haven't necessarily built any muscle if you've got stronger. You can get very strong without actually building any lean muscle tissue. So yeah, that's really why I emphasize the importance of volume.
Yeah, I think people, they don't realise that starting off. They think weight in the bar is just going to make you stronger and you're going to build loads of muscle and all this kind of stuff. And I think as well, it's good to know that now as well, because if people look at, will say, even for myself, you see, I play hurling here in Ireland. It's my main sport, and it is my priority. Hypertrophy does come second to that, but I try to get in a strength portion aspect if I can as the months go on. But I've come to the massive realization lately too that has severely held me back in areas like quad growth and leg growth in general, because I've been low bar squatting for so long that just trying to get strong, and I couldn't really see it because it was probably stroking my ego lifting heavier weight than I would be doing with a high bar squat, for example. But again, now at least people will realize that, right, what is the main priority here? Is it to get bigger fundamentally, or is it to get stronger? Obviously, you need to play around with those as the months progress, and we're going to talk about that probably in a minute anyway. But at least now I think that makes that volume aspect a bit clearer. And you've already said maybe you could start at 10 sets per week per muscle group, and you can add, we'll say, maybe, let's just pretend if that 10 sets was 4 chest exercises spread up across the week. The next week, you do your same 4 exercises again, and you add a set to each. Now you've bumped it up to, what's that? And I said each, like 3 or 14 sets compared to 10, or whatever it is. Just maths are definitely wrong there. But you're adding a set.
14's right.
Yeah, you're adding a set each week, and then I think that's understandable for people until we get to a peak. So you said week 3, it's like crazy volume week. It could be 4 to 6 sets of volume. That's an easy way to put it for people, I suppose. And then the following week, we need to back off, reduce the volume so the fatigue can come down, and then we can progress again after that. So that's clear, I hope, I think. Now, just the intensity factor. Intensity is important because you could be doing 6 sets, 10 sets of chest, Like, is it good to go in and do 10 sets of fucking chest flies and pec deck stuff without, let's say, heavy compounds and not really working in that much of an intensity range, Steve?
So, yeah, I think what you're kind of ensuing, I guess, is like that you see people doing this super light training where they just get like pumped. And whilst the pump and kind of metabolic stress is a driver for hypertrophy, it's not the main driver. Mechanical tension is kind of seen as the main driver, which is driven by heavy enough loads. And when you use something like 60% of your 1 rep max is the typical quoted figure. If you use something that's that or heavier, you tend to be in that range where you're heavy enough to produce hypertrophy. If you're gonna go lighter than that, you have to like go near failure. You have to get a really good pump, because then that's using different pathways to produce hypertrophy. But you're massively holding yourself back if you haven't got any of that heavy work in there. And then that heavy work is best done with lifts that you can safely lift really heavy. So a squat, doing squats in a 6 to 10 rep range is very, very, I mean, even that for some people's cardio, but that's very viable. Whereas doing a leg extension for 6 reps, that might just, that almost feels like a bit of a waste of time and potentially like going to harm. You might even have bad form, or maybe like a lateral raise for the delts. That's not going to be something that's safe. Doing 6 reps with a really heavy weight, you're probably going to be swinging it. So there's much more appropriate exercises to use for those heavy weights, which are very important for hypertrophy. And the benefit of those big compound lifts is they're using multiple muscle groups, so you get massive bang for your buck, which is why I initially said when a novice is getting into the gym, they can almost focus on those big compound lifts like the bench press that's going to hit their delts, going to hit their chest, going to hit their triceps, rather than focusing on like trying to hit everything individually. You're going to be in the gym for hours upon hours if you try and isolate every single muscle group. And you won't be able to use as much tension, and you won't probably get as good hypertrophy if you don't include those big heavy compound basics. Something else that's important with those is it's very hard to progress with isolation movements. Like very often you're using the same weight for kind of even months on end, like to jump 2 kilos on a lateral raise. That, I mean, that's difficult in itself. Sometimes your reps drop down a good 2, 3, 4 reps if you go from like a 10 to a 12 kilo side lateral, whereas you can increase weight much more progressively and in smaller increments as a percentage on something like a squat, bench or deadlift, which is really handy because there is that intensity component towards hypertrophy. And then again, when you do want to do strength work, that becomes important.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned the RPE scale, the rate of perceived exertion, and I think, I don't want to go over it again, but the easiest way to kind of describe that to someone as well is week 1, if you take your squat, for example, and you're doing a set of 6, and you finish that set, and you tell yourself, could I've got 2 more reps in that set, or 3 more reps, so 2 to 3 reps left in the tank would probably equate to an RPE of 7 to 8. And then week 2, the RPE could be kind of, you could say you'd have a target of RPE 8, which could equate to, did I have 2 reps in the tank? And again, one thing that I always say about this, it's all well and good saying you had those reps left in the tank and that you could have done those weights, but then on that 3rd rep, would you get that 3rd rep? Because then if they're thinking in their head, oh, I definitely would have done 2, but they're forgetting I could have done 3 or 4. So that's kind of just an obvious point that people forget about. But as well, what we mean by reps in the tank too is that the reps in the tank that you have left, that they are high quality reps with proper form or technique, if you like. Like breakdown technique, in my eyes, doesn't really count on the RPE scale unless you're really a powerlifter that's going for a max lift strength phase or whatever it is. Would you have any different views on that, Steve?
No, I completely agree. I think it's something I heard from a combination of Mike Boyle and Charles Poliquin was technique failure. So when you're thinking about failure, it's not actually failing, it's failing your technique. So as soon as you have form breakdown, that's failure. So you want to completely have perfect reps for every single one, and that's the way you want to look at it. And yeah, for sure, that the way you describe that is exactly how it's seen, or people might have heard of it as like reps in reserve. That's also another way, or reps from failure. It's all saying the same thing. And I think, just on a side note with that, especially when people are first getting into it, I think filming, and even for me right now, filming my technique or filming my form, and then kind of looking back and thinking, was that like I'd rated it as 2 reps in reserve, and I look at it, I'll be like, either I was maybe not pushing hard enough, or I was right, or I pushed too hard. And it's good to have that feedback tool, because sometimes it feels a lot heavier than it is, or maybe you actually had form failure and you didn't even really realise.
Yeah, no, definitely. And as well, like, even if you think in your head you could have pushed a bit more, looking back over those videos, you know yourself you're progressing on the macro level anyway. And that's why, again, it's so important to document your training and make sure that you're able to look back 3 months previous and see kind of what RPE ranges you're working at, what weight you're working at, what rep range. Because then if you're working at the same RPE 3 months later and you're 10 kilos heavier, but you're thinking there's no progression, that's absolutely huge progression. Like, so it's nice to kind of have that as well.
Yeah.
So Steve, just to sum all that kind of all those factors up, then we'll say week 1 you might start at 10 sets per muscle per group, and you ramp that up over the course of a few weeks. And again, this is something that you're going to need to figure out individually for you. You could be adding a set each week for 4 weeks, and then you hit a wall. You could add 1 set, or you could add your 10 sets week 1. You could go 11 to 12 week 2. You could go 12 to 15 week 3. You could even go up to 50 to 20 week 4 and then deload. But the key thing here is that there is that volume overload progression week by week. Are you working hard enough? Again, that's where you can use a judge by 3 reps in the tank, 2 reps in the tank, a rep in the tank, and then deload. And then just to kind of sum up the deload, Steve, you said reducing the volume is the main factor here for the deload. Like, is there any kind of concrete takeaways you could give for that?
Yeah, so completely right. Volume is the biggest kind of fatigue producer, especially when we're pushing it during the hypertrophy phase. So you basically want to make sure that you come down way below what you have been doing. You're not looking to produce overload. You're not looking to cause a load of fatigue this week. You're literally going in the gym to reduce fatigue. So people will think, oh, why don't I just take a week off? And it's, well, actually, going to the gym and doing some light work is going to keep you recovering faster, and also going to keep your fitness and kind of form higher, because you'll keep that kind of ingrained. Also, I think it's good just for routine practice, and often if people have a week off, they're tempted to have more off, and it kind of falls down the wrong path. But yeah, in terms of volume, I think a great way to do things is to reduce your sets in half from probably your first week of training. So if you're doing 5 sets, reduce down to 2 to 3, or that 10 sets, you now have 5 sets for that muscle group. And then reduce the intensity, probably 10 to 30% is a good range. Kind of stronger people might need to reduce it further. Kind of more novice individuals could get away with a bit more. But what I would say is to remember the goal of that week. It's not about lifting heavy. It's not about doing loads of work. It's just about recovering. So always just edge on the side of caution, and going in there and just doing some light work is going to be the best thing for you to do. And then your RPEs are going to sit around like RPE 5 to 7. It's going to be really light, really easy. It should, at the start of it, you're going to be wanting that deload. By the end of it, you should be craving and really ravenous to get back into the gym and do some heavy work again. So yeah, that's kind of how I'd structure a deload in that case.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's perfect. Thanks for that, Steve. Okay, I think we've definitely covered an awful lot there. That's absolutely brilliant. I'm delighted with that. But one other thing, Steve, that I noticed, I thought I was the only one that used to be kind of really in detail with this for my own training, but one thing that you're big on is just having structured phases for obvious reasons so you can progress. But like stuff like mass phases, fat loss phases, mini cut phases, primer phases. I think the key with this, even for your average Joe who's not really concerned about stepping on a stage or that down the line, I think it's key to have these phases at least somewhat mapped out in your head anyway, because it gives you overall purpose. But above all, for me, it used to give me massive adherence and consistency, not to be kind of messing about week by week, and just tell myself, right, I'm going to this phase at this date, and I should be okay. Maybe I might be messed up a week or two depending on life, but I know at this period or this month I will be in this phase, and then that kept me a lot more on track and consistent. So yeah, like let's just talk about phasing in general and how you kind of map out different phases on a macro level.
Cool. So, yeah, this is periodization and we've talked about your microcycle and your mesocycle. And now we're basically talking about kind of the macro cycle, the long-term view. And this, first of all, gave me, and I bet it helped you in the same way, massive kind of, like you said, the structure, the planning, and the foresight is incredible. And it helped me with my clients. So we always had I could plan their actual whole year of training if I wanted to. And you could structure in deloads when they're on holiday. You could structure in maintenance phases when they had kind of periods in time where they had a lot of stress or periods like that. But yeah, the basic premise of it is that you have periods in time where you focus on specific goals. So you have kind of a mesocycle in which you're focusing on hypertrophy and you're in a calorie surplus. So you're kind of pairing your nutrition with your training to make it the most productive possible. And then when you're in a calorie deficit, the same, you'd actually plan a hypertrophy, you'd kind of turn on the signals for muscle growth with that calorie deficit. And then when you're in strength, when you're in lower volumes, when you're maintaining either your gains or you're trying to bring down your body fat set point or settling point, you're maintaining weight and focusing on strength when the volume's low and you don't have any other needs or things to do. And the basic kind of structure that we've been talking about, I guess, is hypertrophy. And in a sense, you get to a point with your mesocycles of hypertrophy where you kind of get a bit stale and where you can't actually even overload to another mesocycle, and you feel just like nothing good's happening. And at this point, a lot of people then go through the thought of, I'm going to cut. And likewise, you've accumulated not just fatigue and that staleness, but also fat tissue, because when you're in a surplus, inevitably there's some fat that's coming along with that, hopefully not too much, so you can keep your kind of massing phase going for a good 3-4 months. But once you get to that point where, you're a bit fluffy, where your training's a bit stale, you're feeling pretty damn fatigued from all the high volume, and maybe you just don't feel like doing that anymore. A lot of people then are like, right, I want to cut. But this is probably a bad idea, because training adaptations, there's a delayed effect. We know this from strength training. We know you don't necessarily you're not your strongest when you're doing the work that gets you strong. You do work early and then you peak later and get strong later. The same goes for any kind of adaptation in the body. So you're doing all this volume of work, all this hypertrophy training, and then that adaptation, that muscle growth, some of it is going to be a bit delayed and it's going to come later. So if you enter a cut straight away, you're potentially missing out on some of that muscle growth. In addition to that, you're also still in that highly fatigued state. And when you get into a diet, you're going to be even more fatigued because you've got a calorie deficit. So your training isn't going to be very productive. Your body's not going to be very receptive to that hypertrophy stimulus. You're potentially going to lose muscle mass. So I think something that I've introduced recently, and I've termed them primer phases, but you could term them maintenance phases, or people who know Mike Israel's work, resensitization phases, in which you just maintain. You lower your volumes, you focus on strength work, we kind of progress intensity rather than volumes, and you back off on your calories, you just maintain. You actually refresh physiologically and psychologically in that there's less purpose to your training and nutrition now. You're just kind of in the gym and you're letting things settle so that you can come and dominate later, which is why I've called it a primer phase for myself, because I think it primes you for further success. So now you've done your primer phase, you've maintained weight for a period of time, you're sick of maintaining weight, you're sick of not having much kind of purpose with your nutrition, but you're really refreshed and ready to go and destroy maybe some cutting, so you can cut down that fat that you've accumulated during your massing phase, but you've also allowed all of that muscle tissue to have settled and you've gained that all, and you're now sensitive again to that hypertrophy training. So you may even see a bit of a recomposition effect as you're so sensitive to it in that first kind of mesocycle of cutting, so you can actually get the best kind of results from everything. And that in a word is called phase potentiation, and you're phasing your nutrition and your training to potentiate each and next phase, which is a game changer for anyone who kind of loves and is very anal about planning things. And actually, for most people, like you said, even the kind of general population person, they can get into a position where they just end up spinning their wheels for a long time. And if they had this phasic structure just within their head, they could think, I'm not really getting anywhere right now. I'm going to take that primer phase. I'm going to back off for a bit, and then I'll see where I want to go from there. So yeah, that's basic macro cycle periodization for your training and nutrition.
Yeah, brilliant. And it's exactly what we do here as well for our clients as well. Like especially with the training, like right now, our guys are in a strength phase and we're after coming out of 2 very, very high volume blocks. So now you can guess the volume is down. In terms of the main comp on this, we brought the volume up on a conditioning side just for a bit of fun, a bit of crack. We love to have the crack flowing when we have smaller groups in the gym, and then at the end, in about, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks time, we're actually doing a 3 to 5 rep kind of sub maximal testing phase where we're all going to come in a Saturday morning and just see where we're at with things. But they know exactly where they're going. We know exactly where we're going after that strength phase and after that again, and there's no confusion with training, and they know the kind of phases coming up, and you can actually see the excitement as well, like the end of a kind of a deload week and what's coming in the next week. And that's what kind of, it keeps that kind of fire in your training as well. But Steve, I'm going to dumb it down even further. Like we talked about hypertrophy the whole podcast and getting bigger, being in a calorie surplus and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But for that mass phase, would you kind of, like what I kind of say is roughly when we're hitting around 15% body fat, if your outline of your abs at least is kind of going away, that's when we might transition into this maintenance phase, or I might go straight into a mini cut phase, which is what I'm doing myself at the moment. Because for my guys, or the guys that I coach online or here at Doc Fitness, is that like they don't really care too much other than if they have visible abs or not, and everything else then is kind of like everything else is just brilliant. So yeah, like would that be kind of like baseline kind of figures for your guys that would say they're not doing physique competitions? Is that where you'd stop at body fat ranges of a mass phase? And how would you kind of structure their actual fat loss phase? Cool.
So yeah, I think that general recommendation of 15% body fat for males, probably 25% for females, and when we're talking about that, and I'm sure you'd agree, it's not something, well, you might be measuring it, but it's not something I measure with my clients.
No,
because the accuracy of the accuracy of the tools to measure are very inaccurate, so there's almost a point. So the idea of having kind of visible abs is a good one for males and probably females as well to an extent, because most males and females are fairly lean in that area for the most part, when they do get lean, because some people struggle. So that's where I'd say there is some individual difference in that some people just don't feel great even when they've got visible abs, and they have their most productive training when they are a bit fatter. I think that is generally people who have been a bit overweight in the past, who do have a bit of a higher kind of body fat settling point or set point where they feel healthy at. But for the most part, yeah, totally. 15% is a good place to draw the line so they can stay insulin sensitive, so they can stay kind of feeling healthy and productive. They can keep their partitioning ratios in the right place, so they're potentiating as much muscle growth over fat gain as possible. And then structuring a cut would be very, very similar to how I would structure a kind of massing phase, in that training would look very, very similar. You'd still be looking to progress with volumes over time. You'd still be looking to train up towards your maximal recoverable volume, the most volume you can do and recover from. But the difference is you're in a diet now. So you're going to have to be much more precise in terms of kind of, you can't just add it and not like chuck a couple of sets every week. That's probably going to be a bit too aggressive, especially towards the end of the cut. You have to really monitor that volume, because your volume is probably going to have to at a stage come down from what it was during your massing phase, because you haven't got as many nutrients to recover from. And that's also a point for, in general, you might use a bit of a lower intensity in some places, especially in the deeper, darker stages of a cut, where you just the higher intensity stuff, maybe 6s, are just too heavy and you cannot recover from that sort of work. Whereas if you were doing mostly like sets of 12s, they're much more easier to recover. You can get much more productive volume and you can feel much healthier in that range. In terms of kind of weight loss from week to week, or month to month, even for females, they might want to be looking at that because of their cycles. I'd be looking at about a 1% loss on average for most people to be lost every week. So for a female, maybe that's a 4-month decrease from the month before to their body weight. So that's kind of specific to them in their scenario. If they're much fatter than that 15%, then they might want to go for like a 1.5. But if they're at that kind of upper end of where we say is productive massing, starting off at 1%, and then if they were to extend their kind of cutting phase for a while and wanted to get really lean, as they get leaner, they'd want to lose at a slower pace because now they've got less fat tissue to draw from. There's more risk of muscle loss, so they'd want to do that. I don't know if you want me to get into specifics of kind of macros, but they wouldn't look too different from your massing phase. You'd still want protein at around a gram per pound. You probably want to set your fat at basically a minimum for health, which is normally about 0.3 grams per pound, and then make up the rest from carbohydrates, because that's really going to fuel your training. That's going to fuel your training, keep your performance high, and that's going to retain the most muscle. It's also going to keep you fuller and allow you to have higher fiber foods, whereas fats are very nutrient dense. A lot of people just kind of hate fats during a diet because you can eat a handful of nuts and they count for like 200-300 calories, and you're like, I could have had like a massive bowl of oats for that. So yeah, that's generally how I would think about structuring a cutting phase. Although I will include an important detail in which we talked about deloads, and I like to use a deload with a diet break. And a diet break isn't just going completely off track. For some people, it might be just not tracking for a week and eating to satisfaction. For others, it might be actually tracking, making sure to have plenty of carbohydrates and raising calories to maintenance levels so they can really replete substrates, really recover, and be refreshed for another round of dieting, just like your deload would do. And you just emphasize that by having the diet break as well. So I don't tend to use refeeds so much. Some females, I use them. They find them particularly beneficial. In some scenarios, I tend to just use a reactive refeed, I've kind of called it. I don't know if that's someone else has used that phrase, but I like to use a reactive refeed, in which basically if my client's saying that they've got an occasion or an event, or they're feeling particularly run down, I might throw in a day at maintenance calories, where we just bring up calories via carbohydrates, because that is the biggest influence on kind of their performance, and also to bring down even their hunger signaling. But for the most part, I don't use refeeds if I can help it, and just rely on the diet breaks, because they seem to have a much more permanent increase in kind of that metabolic slowdown, that diet fatigue that everyone knows and experiences. So yeah, I think I kind of went on a big ramble about how I set up a cutting phase, but probably missed out some essential bits. But yeah.
No, I think it's after making me realise now that I could probably get you back on for probably 3 to 4 more podcasts talking about phasing alone. So if you're interested, Steve, we might actually set that up, because Jesus, we could do a full podcast on a mass phase, a fat loss phase, and a primer phase, and keep them kind of short and dense in content. Because yeah, we talked a lot about the progression stuff before this, so people are probably heads are fried now when they get onto the massing stuff. But no, the fact you've gone a good bit deeper there than I actually was expecting in my own head. If you're interested in the future, we'll definitely get you back on to talk more about those in detail. But no, that's brilliant.
People are interested.
Yeah,
for sure.
Definitely. And I suppose, guys, if you are listening to this, just let me know on Instagram, and we'll get that started, I suppose. So yeah, Steve, I'm going to start rounding things up, and I do like to finish off the podcast, just a couple of random stuff really, just to kind of break the tone a bit. And I suppose one thing I wanted to ask you was, I don't really know much else about you myself, so if you weren't in the fitness industry, what would you love to give a crack to? Or do you have any like daft hobbies or anything like
that? Well, as a child, I was literally football crazy. So I know it's kind of it's kind of fitness related, but if I could be anything, it would have been a footballer. I absolutely love football with a passion. So that's probably where I would go to. I don't actually it's really sad. And I don't know, you might be similar to me in this fact. I think a few people in the fitness industry are. I just don't actually have any side hobbies apart from kind of the fitness industry. However, I can probably give a bit of the gym is basically me. I do like watching some crappy TV now and then. So anyone who's watching Love Island right now, that is something I am unfortunately admitting to watching, because it just, you can just switch off to it.
What was it? Love Island?
Love Island, yeah. If you haven't watched it, you probably don't want to. It's kind of like Big Brother, but just relationships.
And I think you're a fan of Suits as well, aren't you?
Oh, Suits. I love Suits and anime. I loved Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z, all of that. That was all good stuff as well. And Marvels, all of those movies. Interesting. Yeah. No, I actually, I said this earlier on a few episodes ago about the fact that I left college as a secondary school woodwork and design and communication graphics teacher. So I actually have a big passion and hobby for making stuff out of wood. But again, I haven't really kind of come back to that in about 4 or 5 years now, because I just don't have any workshop anymore, and all my money went into the gym. But in the coming years, definitely want to get a little mini workshop set up and get back into that again, because like I could spend days making stuff in the garage. And very cool.
Yeah. So Steve, do you have any random, let's say, or what's your worst, or no, what worst? What's your most embarrassing gym story from? Probably from a few years back, or even recently, if there's any.
Oh man, I actually don't know what's embarrassing. I can't think of anything that I've done that's necessarily very embarrassing. I guess I find this embarrassing was kind of, my old deadlift technique was embarrassing, but that's not like nothing. I can't think of anything I've done that's laugh out loud embarrassing. But I have. Yeah, I mean, just some of my technique and my form back in the day when I used to go to the gym at uni, it was just awful. And I'm embarrassed to say, I ended up actually causing myself a permanent injury and this is why I suck at powerlifting, a permanent injury to my left shoulder, in which I was incline benching and I just kept going. And I tore I've got a lesion of my slap tendon. It's something that joins your biceps, your shoulder muscle. So I've got a very unstable pressing base. So my bench press is very weak. My overhead press is very weak. So I'm actually embarrassed to say that I caused myself permanent damage in the gym through having poor technique. Yeah,
but there's the flip side of that, though. There's a big lesson for you going forward and for the people you coach as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, interesting. Yeah. And my biggest question is, which I round off every podcast with, what was your biggest lesson from 2016, Steve? I know we're practically halfway gone for it now. We are halfway gone, but what was the biggest lesson from 2016 if you were to look back?
2016. I think just a reinforcement of the fact that the grounding principles in training and nutrition don't really change and haven't changed for years upon years. And if you were to just focus on those as any trainee, as any coach, you wouldn't go too far wrong. Just the more I read, the more I learn, the more I see research coming out, the more I realize that if you do hold to those basics, you couldn't go too far wrong and you could see tremendous results. I wish I had a really specific lesson from 2016, but I can't actually think of anything that I particularly learned.
No, it's nice to drive home those points though, because people just need to hear it and they need to hear it over and over again. So that's brilliant. And Steve, I suppose, will I just direct people towards your Instagram? That's probably where you're most active, is it?
Yeah, Instagram, or even revivestronger.com has probably the best thing for people is the podcast. That's a great place to learn, and the blogs. But yeah, anything, Revive Stronger is my tag, so I am available everywhere on that if they want to search me out.
Yeah, and you share most things, if not everything, from the website and what you do anyway, so I would recommend people, if you want to get following Steve, Instagram is, no more than myself, is probably the best place to do it. But yeah, Steve, I'll hook all those notes and links and whatnot up in the show notes. And Look, buddy, thanks very much for coming on. I will definitely talk to you about getting back on in the future, and we shall chat to you soon.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
So guys, that was Steve Hall, and hopefully you've enjoyed that one. I know there was a wealth of information there, and we actually got a lot deeper into stuff that I was intended on covering. So yeah, I suppose with podcasts like this, when there's that kind of depth of information, it's always good to go back and kind of just get the concrete takeaways from it. But like, the main takeaway I want you to get from this is kind of knowing how to pre-plan, even roughly, like phases in advance, or we'll say phases you intend to go through. And even if you wanted to get on a course to get a bit more clarity behind that, and kind of the tactics and strategies and the tools and methods to get there. And then the main takeaways behind volume and frequency. So how much do you do in a given session or across the week? How often do you do that across the week, and how do you produce overload? And then we talked about deloads and that kind of stuff. So again, just to make sure that you're kind of clear on those points, it's probably good to go back over the sections of the podcast that have those kind of main takeaways and just kind of drive them home for yourself. And as always, the show notes will be on docfitnessonline/episode 8. And a big thank you again for tuning in. And just for the future, again, if you have any questions, just direct message me on Instagram. It's the easiest place to get in touch with me, because I do reply to all of those. And we shall chat to you soon. Bye bye.